Hello and welcome to the next lecture in World Politics. And today we're going to be talking about poverty and development. But quickly, I just wanted to introduce myself. So I'm taking over from Ian for the last 4 weeks of the module. I'm Abby Kendrick, and I originally trained as an economist, but I've migrated to politics. Some of the material that we'll cover in the next 4 weeks has a little bit of an economics vibe to it, but really I want to explore these topics in the context of international relations. And to that end, I encourage you to sort of don't lose sight of what you've done before with Ian, and I encourage you to really explore possible reflections that you might have on these topics from the learning that you've covered in the last, 15 weeks. So here I am. This is a picture of me in my home office. You'll be listening to me coming through your airwaves. I'm not going to kind of put loads of reading on the reading list. You've probably seen that there aren't sort of a bunch of readings on the reading list for these topics. But if you do want to kind of learn more about these topics, if you do want to write on these topics for your essay or in the exam, do reach out to me. You can drop me a line. Here is my email address, a.kendrick, and also feel free to sign up to any of my advice and feedback hours, which you'll find information about on my webpage. So that is a little bit of housekeeping. Let's get going. So the ambition for today is to sort of understand, or at least go away with a sense of why global poverty is political. So you might sort of think, why are we doing sort of international development in world politics? So hopefully you'll get a sense of why we might look at global poverty in a world politics course. Secondly, we'll go through a brief history of international development agenda, so the types of things that you might have heard about in terms of the World Bank and United Nations development talks. And we'll also look at poverty measurement, and I've put here and its discontent, so we'll be taking a pretty critical view of the way that poverty is measured in these agenda. And finally, we'll sort of consider poverty as ideology and the implications of seeing poverty as ideology for world politics. Before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty, I've got a short 90-second task for you. So if you kind of pause the video for a short while after this, but given what you know, or sort of from your own intuition, would you say that the world has become better or worse off since the end of the Cold War, sort of from the 1990s onwards? And so have a go at putting some figures against the vertical axis of the chart here. What percentage of the global population do you estimate was in extreme poverty in 1990? And what would be your estimate for that figure today? So have a go at kind of plotting what you think has happened to the global extreme poverty rate over this period of time. So pause the video, maybe spend 90 seconds-ish plotting that rate over time. So I imagine that you probably have a chart that looks something like this, although perhaps with slightly different rates on the y-axis. And if you do have different numbers that sort of look very different to this, I challenge you to sort of reflect a little bit on why that might be the case after the lecture. But as we can see here, so this is according to the latest World Bank data, global extreme poverty was falling rapidly over the quarter century, sort of 1990 towards 2015, about 1 percentage point per year. From 2015 onwards, we've seen sort of a slowing down of that rate, and so kind of percentage point declines of around 0.5 percentage points year on year from 2015, but the direction of travel is still in the negative, declining global extreme poverty over time. And this is a bit of an interlude, but I thought it would be worth mentioning given the current situation that we're in, and how this will likely change the direction of travel that we've seen up to now. So global poverty rates, according to the World Bank, have been declining since sort of 1990s, but we're in a stage now where actually global extreme poverty might rise for the first time in so many years. And so I'm kind of using the World Bank's words here. It's difficult to say. In that COVID-19 and the economic crisis are already reversing hard-won gains against global poverty, ending more than 2 decades of continuous progress. So beyond 2017 here, the line is a bit hypothetical because we don't have the data just yet, but essentially these scenarios are based on growth projections. So the orange line here is kind of based on the trend that was happening pre-COVID. The dark blue line and the light blue line are what the World Bank are calling COVID-19 downside and COVID-19 baseline. So they're using post-COVID predicted growth rates, which sort of in this light blue line predict a contraction in global growth in 2020 of about 5 percentage points, and this dark blue line a contraction of 8%. So globally, extreme poverty is predicted to increase for the first time in recent history, at least according to the World Bank. So it has become a sort of stylized fact that global poverty has fallen over the last several decades. But the question we're going to be exploring in the rest of the lecture is, how much do we really know about global poverty, global extreme poverty? And when you start to dig into more detail about how the folks at the World Bank come to know what they know, things get a little less certain. So I have a couple of sort of guiding questions here, but has poverty actually fallen? Now, it's difficult to dispute that poverty has declined in the long run, at least in the sort of most minimal sense. If you take the past 100 years of history, say, and if we look at our own countries, it's pretty obvious. Even if we look at so-called developing countries, there's certainly been a decline in poverty in a kind of minimalist sense. But what does that mean for people's real experiences, especially those of poor people in both sort of subjective and objective sense? So what do the claims of the folks at the World Bank really mean, and why are they saying what they're saying about poverty? This leads us to the second question. So we're talking about poverty and poverty rates falling over time, but according to whose authority and by what measures has poverty fallen? So the point to stress here is really that measurement is fundamentally a political exercise because it involves a lot of value judgments in terms of what we think poverty is, and also because we're dealing with thresholds. So, what we're saying is how little of the stuff that we think makes up poverty does a person or country have in order to qualify them as being poor. So right here already we can see at least some scope for ideological elements to enter in, or at least sort of a set of ideas about the best way of ordering the social and economic world, which then factor into our understanding of poverty and by association development. So we need a deeper questioning of the meaning of poverty and the underlying political or ideological positions that inform it, which for our purposes as sort of students of world politics, this matters because we want to know how those meanings are then used and translated into international relations. But first, let's take a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the channels or vehicles, if you like, through which these meanings operate, the ways in which they have influence and even become institutionalized. And what I'm talking about here is the development agenda in general and how poverty and development are sort of represented at the international level. So recall from Ian's last lecture that the purpose of the World Bank in theory is to promote the long-term growth performance of low and middle income countries and sort of eliminating poverty at the same time. And we can trace the birth of the World Bank's World Development Reports, and that's what the WDR is standing for here, back to a chap called Robert McNamara, who was the president of the World Bank in the late 1960s and up to the early 80s, who sort of saw that growth wasn't equitably reaching the poor, and that the poor don't really significantly contribute to growth. And so, back then in one speech, he actually called for an eradication of absolute poverty by the end of the 20th century, which we've seen the world hasn't yet achieved, even in the most minimalist sense. Anyhow, these World Development Reports are really the flagship publications, not of the World Bank as a whole, but of its sort of research department, which is headed by the bank's chief economist. And now that person, the chief economist, always has kind of overall responsibility for the report and can on occasion sort of use it as a vehicle for publicising his or her or their own views about development policy or the importance of particular topics. But we're going to go back into history to sort of frame the beginnings of these reports. And so the first report, it appeared in 1978, and its purpose, in, again, Robert McNamara's words, was to provide a comprehensive assessment of global development issues. And in the early days, the first few reports really had the ambition to map the terrain of development identifying the sectoral sort of sources of growth, things like increasing productivity in agriculture and increasing energy efficiency, and kind of pathways to increasing efficiency more generally. But these reports also arrived at some baseline measures of poverty, which made poverty tangible by offering kind of numerical information on the extent and depth of poverty around the world. So this seems sort of rather modest by today's standard, but at the time this was a pretty big deal. But then, sort of amidst the development collapses of the 1980s and 90s, and known as the kind of lost decade in Latin America and the lost 2 decades in sub-Saharan Africa, well, poverty and solutions to it, solutions according to the World Bank that is, these came sharply into focus in subsequent reports. I wanted to flag here that these so-called lost decades were mixed up in broader international issues related to the debt crisis that struck developing countries in the early 80s, but we'll look at that in a little more detail in a bit. So, with this sharper focus on poverty, the 1990 report, and this was aptly entitled Poverty, so this is famous for introducing the international dollar a day poverty standard and kind of the associated poverty counts that came with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now. So I'm calling these types of measures, the type of measures like the World Bank's dollar a day measure, money metric, because I'm following the naming conventions used by an academic called Andrew Fisher, who has done lots of work on these types of things. And so what we're trying to establish here is, how little money does one need to have in order to be considered poor? There is often a bit of confusion about what money metric measures of poverty include. So it's important to know that what's being counted isn't just monetized income or expenditure, how much actual money I earn in a wage or how much I spend on food, for instance, but these measures do also include non-monetized income or expenditure. So labor that I could sell in kind, or subsistence production where I eat what I grow. So the value of these non-monetized or kind of own production and consumption is usually approximated in surveys by using market prices, as if the things that were produced and or consumed in-house, so to speak, had in fact been sold. And I guess I will leave it to you to consider all of the possible non-monetized aspects of life and the degree to which you think this might enhance income or consumption. And this is kind of a long-standing debate in feminist development economics, but essentially what these measures are doing is converting what we earn and what we spend into a common unit, and that is money. And so money here is being used as an indirect measure of poverty, with the logic that money is a primary concern and is a good indicator of poverty. So how much income I have or how much access to goods and services I have in terms of the quantity of those goods and services I consume will tell us something useful about poverty, which seems quite intuitive. But of course, this really restricts the metric to only those things that could be converted into money, which is unlikely to give us a full picture of welfare more generally. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But there are essentially 2 sides of money metric poverty measures. On the one side, we have the measurement of people's incomes, expenditures and wealth, which is collected through surveying, and it's quite common for all sorts of other purposes. And on the other side, we have the calculation of the poverty line, which is a threshold under which one is, as we said, considered to have deficient income, expenditure or wealth. And this line is essentially dividing the poor from the non-poor. So people in poverty are those whose level of income or consumption is not enough to cover some minimum amount of goods and services. And leading on from those World Bank kind of world development reports, the most familiar money metric measure of poverty is the World Bank's dollar a day measure. Well, it was actually $1.08 a day, to be precise, back in the day. And it has since been updated to $1.25 in 2008, and it's now $1.90. And so that was based on updated data on prices in 2015. But it is kind of assumed here that the sort of real value between these different dollar a day estimates, poverty lines, are the same. So, $1.90 in today's money is the same as $1.25 was in 2005. But again, I will leave you to consider the validity of that assumption. So, how is it calculated? Well, we start with national poverty lines, which usually reflect again, a line below which a person's minimum, let's say, nutritional, clothing and shelter needs cannot be met in that country. And so not surprisingly, richer countries would tend to have higher poverty lines, while poorer countries have lower poverty lines. But I think the World Bank measure is now based on national poverty lines of 15 of the world's poorest countries, and that's averaged out. But we need a poverty line that measures poverty in all countries by the same standard. So the national poverty rates in these 15 countries need to be converted into a common currency, and the World Bank do this by using what they call purchasing power parity rates, so these PPP rates. I'll leave it to you to look this up, but essentially it's not talking about market exchange rates, we're talking about purchasing power. So how much currency do I need in order to buy the same bundle of goods in different countries? I'm going to leave you and pause for a second with a question. Do you really see any issues with this way of measuring the poverty threshold? So the World Bank rely on national poverty lines of 15 of the world's poorest countries. Do you see any issues with measuring poverty in that way? Well, a fundamental problem with money metric measures of poverty is that they exclude aspects of a decent life that are difficult, if not impossible, to monetize. So you can think about things like health and education. Expenditures on health and education, or their sort of value as public goods, aren't recorded in income and expenditure surveys. And even if they were, we wouldn't really know if this was how much people would like to spend or how good these services are in terms of actually keeping us healthy and educated. So it could be argued that there is likely to be a reasonably strong correlation between income and these other goods and services, but the data in many instances really points to the opposite. Falling money metric poverty often goes sort of hand in hand with deteriorating health, for instance. So in response to this conundrum, many scholars really opt to promote a multidimensional measure of poverty, and this was inspired in large part by the work of Amartya Sen. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Sen's Development as Freedom as a segue into his main ideas. So here we go. Annapurna wants someone to clear up the garden, which has suffered from past neglect, and 3 unemployed labourers, Dinu, Bishanu and Rajini, all very much want the job. She can hire any one of them, but the work is indivisible and she cannot distribute it among the 3. Annapurna would get much the same work done for much the same payment from any of them, but being a reflective person, she wonders who would be the right person to employ. She gathers that while all of them are poor, Dinu is the poorest of the 3. She also gathers that Bishanu has recently been impoverished and is psychologically most depressed about his predicament. But Annapurna is also told that Rajini is debilitated from a chronic ailment and could use the money to rid herself of that terrible disease. It is not denied that Rajini is less poor than the others, and also not the unhappiest, but Annapurna wonders whether nevertheless it might not be right to give the job to Rajini. It would make the biggest difference. So what this little thought experiment really highlights is the different ways that we might conceptualize poverty. So Dinu's case focuses on income poverty, Bishanu's on the metric of happiness or subjective well-being, and Rajini's, which is the case Sen presents Sen presents arguments for, is the relationship between income, or what Sen calls endowments more generally, and the capability to lead a life that one has reason to value. So it recognises that income might be an important means to kind of command certain goods, but it is equally, if not more important, to be aware that that same level of income might translate into different levels of need satisfaction kind of between different people due to differences in their personal characteristics and needs. And so to give this a little more substance, I'll just run through a quick example. So let's say that I have a bag of rice and Sen calls this an endowment. And I also value being nourished, and Sen calls this a functioning. But having a bag of rice or the income required to buy a bag of rice doesn't necessarily guarantee that I'll be nourished. So, having this bag of rice doesn't mean that I end up in this nice, happy state of feeling nourished. So what is missing, according to Sen, is some sort of understanding of the means of exchange between having a bag of rice and being nourished. Just an example, if I'm a woman living in a household with a violent partner that kind of doesn't allow me to eat sufficient amounts of rice in order to be nourished, I don't have the opportunity to exchange my endowment, the bag of rice, into a functioning that I value, being nourished. Likewise, what if I have a tapeworm? That means the calories I consume don't end up in me being nourished. So in both cases, I really lack the capability to be nourished since my exchange opportunities are limited. So seeing kind of this opportunity in terms of capability allows us to distinguish between whether I possess the means or instruments or permissions to pursue what I would like to do, and whether I actually am able to do the things I value doing. So by kind of shifting the attention towards the latter of those, the capability-based approach really resists an over-concentration on means, so things like incomes or rice and primary goods, as a measure of poverty, and instead sees poverty as capability deprivation, where poverty is seen as being deprived in the ability to exchange these types of endowments into the things I have reason to value, or what Sen would call functionings. So capability in this sense is a kind of potential, and Sen presents this as an essential, but it's quite a complex freedom that really constitutes development. So the essence of development is really an expansion in the ability to live the life that I have reason to value. And this is what multidimensional measures of poverty really try to capture. And so the Human Development Reports were originally meant as a counterweight to the World Bank's World Development Reports, to give a human face to development. And the Human Development Index of the UNDP, so it still includes a GDP per capita component as a measure of sort of wealth in poverty, but it complements it with other human development measures, which are in practice essentialised as education in health. And again, just as a bit of background, there are lots of different updated variations of the Human Development Index, and these are the measures that really come out of the Human Development Reports. So they've been adjusted for things like gender, inequality. But in the most recent reports, what we're seeing is an index called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and this was developed by Sabina El-Kire, and this has been sort of adopted as the index in terms of human development at the UN. And it could be said that the Sustainable Development Goals are really an attempt to kind of mainstream this non-monetary approach or conceptualization of poverty and development. And the MPI is a sort of composite measure of how well a country is doing in meeting these various goals. And really, kind of as a broader point, these goals also signal a merging of the two main development agenda, with the UN probably moving more towards the World Bank than the other way around. But we'll talk a little bit more on that next. But for now, take a quick breather, and I will see you, or you'll hear me rather, in 5. So when I asked you earlier about any problems you might have spotted with the World Bank's PPP poverty line, one of those problems might have something to do with their reliance on national poverty lines to determine it. So remember that the World Bank's $1.90 a day poverty line is based on national poverty lines of, I think, 15 of the poorest countries. And these countries are likely to have, super weak social assistance systems and very constrained fiscal resources. Now, we might think that the World Bank, being full of very clever economists, must come up with the poverty line very scientifically, and that the calculations are based on some, real calculation of real basic needs. But no, they rely on the national poverty lines of these 15 very poor countries. So, do you see any political reason why national poverty lines in those countries might not be super accurate? Might there be political reasons why a government might want to show very high or very low poverty rates and kind of marshal their poverty lines accordingly? I would be inclined to say perhaps yes. And so we think of these lines as scientific and objective, but even at this level, they're really just artifacts of very politicized exercises. Now, there are lots of examples of countries, I'm going to say manipulating poverty lines. And I was kind of thinking of a good example, and India is just one. And now India is an interesting case given its distribution of income, but also its relative sufficiency in statistical technology. And so in India, the poverty line is tied to assistance. So higher poverty lines are going to oblige local governments, because in the Indian case, poverty lines are decentralised. So it could oblige local governments to actually spend more than they're really able to do. So in this sense, official national poverty lines are a subject of constant political contestation. They might be regularly revised, they might not. But all of this sort of revision or non-revision is really in function of these contests between various contending power factions. And even if we take the more forgiving view that governments set out with the intention of measuring poverty accurately, we have to ask the question of whether they really have the sort of statistical and technical capacity to serve and reach the very poorest in society. So many of the 15 countries in the mix, it could be argued that they don't really have the technical capacity to collect the kind of data that is required to set these national poverty lines in the first place. How do we even determine what are basic needs? And so there are many ways that we can do this, but kind of most often we actually look at the cost of food to provide a certain number of calories that are required for some kind of level of subsistence. But what if poor people in different countries do very different jobs, and these jobs are very physically demanding? Should we really use the same standard of food needs for all? And then what about non-food needs? So you might have food, but you need fuel to cook it. You might have a job in order to buy the food, but how far do you have to travel to work? What is the cost of transport in different countries? All of these things are also likely to take up an ever greater share in costs to fulfill basic needs, particularly as kind of the terms of trade for food continue to decline, although that might be changing soon if we see world food prices increasing. But really this means that food becomes cheaper and cheaper, and non-food costs become more and more expensive, relatively speaking. And so this is problematic when non-food costs are set at a constant proportion of food costs, which in many poverty measures they are. And multidimensional indicators do not escape these issues either. So there's loads of sort of arbitrariness in selecting thresholds and even the relevance of many of the dimensions in themselves. So to give just an example, one of the indicators in the MPI is whether a household has a dirt, sand, dung or other type of floor. And in MPI terms, a concrete floor is better than a dirt, sand or dung floor. But perhaps kind of the transition from dung to concrete is really due to a broader process of structural transformation or so-called development that sees many folks move out of subsistence agriculture into sort of a commodified consumption. And this kind of often goes hand in hand with urbanisation. But who's really to say that these folks are indeed better off? There's kind of an implicit undervaluation of the types of functional value that might come with a subsistence livelihood over a commodified one. And again, this is kind of quite an ideological underpinning, and it might not be explicit, but it's there. So the kind of central message here is that the scope for discretion that allows for the entry of politics into the calculus of these measures is huge. And even though the main data relied upon by the leading international organisations who are spearheading the promotion of various development goals, they are not really all that scientific. Some choices are pretty arbitrary, and I mean, this in itself could be deemed quite political given the sensitivity and uncertainties of just who is poor by these criteria, and then, of course, the sort of lack of any local political legitimacy. So we can see many ways in which measures of poverty and development are not apolitical, and instead we can kind of think of them as being constituted by politics and ideology. So kind of politics and ideology goes into their very construction. But the link really doesn't stop there. And we can also see how the causal arrow runs the other way. So in the sense that, measures also play a role in the shaping of politics and ideas that surround poverty and development at the global level. So we're going to go back in history to the early 1980s when the world was in dire straits. So the sort of long boom of the 60s was well and truly over. There was lots of borrowing that had been going on in developing countries in the 70s. Developing countries were on the verge of a huge sort of hike in oil prices in the late 70s. And kind of their response to this, or the way that they dealt with it, was sort of a massive rise in interest rates, which then had steep falls in commodity prices. And as a result of this, developing countries were really unable to repay the spiraling debts that they had accumulated. So what was the IMF and World Bank to do? Well, they kind of pursued a vigorous policy of structural adjustment lending throughout the developing world. And the two IFIs really worked together to encourage developing countries to pursue market-oriented strategies, open their borders to foreign investment, and sort of adopt a small state culture that really saw reductions in spending on things like education, health and welfare. Exports were promoted so that these countries could earn the foreign exchange necessary to keep up with their debt repayments. And keeping up debt payments was really the key here. And even in the 1991 World Development Report, sort of suggesting that the strong states were those that succeeded in stabilising their economies and introducing market-friendly reforms. And so particularly in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, kind of state participation in the economy was drastically curtailed. Government enterprises passed to private hands in the name of so-called efficiency, and any kind of protectionist barrier on imports were eliminated. Restrictions on foreign investment were lifted, and through sort of export-first policies, domestic economies were more tightly integrated into, let's say, the capitalist world market. But the 1990s were about as bad as things could get for many developing countries, subject to this kind of one-size-fits-all medicine of structural adjustment. And this medicine was super painful because it curbed demand, it affected governments' ability to finance sort of lots of different activities, and it also opened economies to trade and capital flows. And so, dogmatically applied, these types of programs, a lot of evidence suggests, caused more harm than good. And again, as a reminder, kind of the state of human development, or the lack of it, is what really prompted a different take on poverty measurement in the first human development reports. So we're sort of seeing that growth isn't bringing about poverty reduction, or at least even if we just think about poverty reduction as income poverty, this isn't given a good characterization of the real lived experiences of people in developing countries at that time. But the bank was persistent. The role of kind of market fundamentalism, it only deepened and sort of was echoed through the reports issued throughout the 90s. And the bank was really persuaded that creating macroeconomic stability and weeding out these sort of internal distortions, subjecting resource allocation to market discipline, were the keys to growth and poverty reduction. And again, kind of recalling from Ian's last lecture, this sort of policy position really argues that poverty reduction accompanies growth with the objective of enabling the poor to find their way into the market economy as participants in the labour market. And these types of policies are what became known as the Washington Consensus. And along came the Millennium Development Goals following the Millennium Declaration in the year 2000. And I'm going to present an argument presented by, again, Andrew Fisher, who raises a question as to why poverty benchmarks from which the world should be advancing start in 1990. So if you go back to MDG goal number 1, it was to halve the proportion of people whose income is less than $1.25 a day, as it was then, between 1990 and 2015. So we're looking at the halving of poverty rates between these 2 years, 1990 2015. This goal was in fact met 5 years ahead of time according to the data. But why use 1990 as the start date? Andrew Fisher sort of notes this as being pretty curious. So Fisher argues that close to half of the improvement in the poverty rate since 1990, so thinking back to that chart that we saw at the beginning, those sort of improvements in extreme poverty since 1990, well, what Fisher is arguing is that half of these, or close to half of these improvements, really kind of effectively represent recuperation of lost ground. So previous development gains were made up to the 1970s, but then kind of these debilitating assaults during the 1980s on the means that were used to achieve these previous gains. It's really a recuperation from that assault that is represented in these poverty statistics. This is Fisher's argument. And so the choice of 1990 as a start date for the MDGs, in this sense, again, according to Fisher, is predisposed towards revisionist narratives bent on erasing the memory of these previous gains and the damage that was done to development in the 80s. So instead, it kind of lends itself to interpreting any recovery from deep economic depression as a vindication of the prevailing international economic and political system that, of course, according to him, in part caused the depression in the first place. So this kind of idea that starting at 1990 is some vindication of the prevailing economic and political system. As an aside, Andrew Fisher in his other work actually takes another curious look at the economics kind of pop literature that's cropped up on poverty and development. And it's sort of interesting to see that all of them start with data series that start from kind of the mid-1980s onwards. So when most countries were in post-crisis, post-austerity, and were able to regain a little bit of fiscal capacity at this time. But yeah, kind of the absence of history in these pop books doesn't seem to bother them. So what might be going on here? Well, I've put this slide in just because I thought that we shouldn't, well, perhaps it would be wrong to isolate these development narratives from broader world politics at the time. So here we have two important characters. You probably recognise them, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And if you don't, they were the UK PM and US President throughout the 1980s. But these two folks really played a central role in, I'm going to say, ushering in a major ideological shift in the championing of neoliberal economic values and really sort of accelerating the globalization process too. And so kind of thinking about the types of policies that were being pursued through the Washington Consensus, Thatcher even kind of popularized it with a slogan, "There is no alternative." So kind of with these two world leaders as champions and the IMF and World Bank as executors, the Washington Consensus was really generalized throughout the developing world. And of course, their ideological legacy lives on. And I just wanted to pull out sort of one of the findings, or one of the kind of the recommendations from the latest World Development Report, which speaks to that idea, in that, you know, not much has changed, and that sort of legacy lives on through the World Development Reports today. So here the poor need jobs, they need credit, they need roads, they need markets and efficient institutions. And, you know, if a country is going to do well in life, it needs market reforms and economic growth, which are essential to achieving these opportunities. And yeah, as I said, if you look at the World Development Reports over time, not much has changed in a sort of ideas or ideological sense. But we can see this ideological shift in the Human Development Agenda over time too. And although it's quite subtle, there are signs of an implicit bias towards what I would call orthodox neoclassical economic approaches to poverty alleviation and development, particularly in recent human development reports, and other approaches that really rely on these multidimensional measures of poverty. So first, if we think about the implications of the capability approach and the MPI, it's really that the route out of poverty is through the build-up of functionings, but importantly, these functionings are an expression of freedom. So what this is saying is it's the freedom to function that really counts. It's having the freedom to be in good health or having the freedom to kind of be well nourished. So how do we have the freedom to function? Well, we have freedom in a number of domains, but the most efficient means of expressing our freedom is through markets. We have freedom to work and earn money in free labour markets in order to be housed, well nourished, sheltered. We have freedom to buy consumables like mobile phones or televisions through free import and export markets. And we have those in order to have the freedom to participate in labour markets too, so double freedom. But the kind of central point is that we have good reasons to buy and sell, to exchange, and to seek lives that can flourish on the basis of transactions. And that's in Sen's words there. And Sen's approach to development really falls within the family of liberal theorization. So Sen is a liberal, not a neoliberal, and he emphasizes not only economic freedom, so kind of economic freedom through markets, but he also emphasizes different types of freedom, so political and social freedom too. And he sees these freedoms as compatible and mutually reinforcing, and others would likely to disagree, those of a kind of a different ontological persuasion, and perhaps even argue that economic freedom is fundamentally at odds with social and political freedom. And I'll leave it to you to think through your own position on that. But common to liberal theory, Sen's perspective on poverty and development is also individualist in the sense that the entity being developed or taken out of poverty is the capability of the individual, so not the group or society. And poverty reduction is really the aggregation of individual developments. But some authors, like Bagchi and Levitt, would say that this kind of ontological individualism could actually undermine poverty reduction as a social or collective transformative project, and that actually sort of this kind of makes way for the adoption of these ideas by IFIs, and kind of sneaking in those neoliberal ideas. This kind of also raises deeper questions about the application of liberal modes of analysis to complex historical and social phenomena. So can conceptions of freedom really be abstracted from their historical, social and cultural context? Mainstream poverty and development theory tells us next to nothing about how kind of we got to where we are, which Marxist institutionalists, post-colonialists and feminists would argue are very important when it comes to explaining poverty and development. So now we come to the kind of so what question. Well, poverty and development agenda alter production in the developing world by both kind of directly influencing policy and programs and also indirectly through ideas. And so again, if we think back to Ian's lecture on production, if we kind of say that production really matters for world politics, as it does for Marxists and many feminists, then poverty and development really matter for world politics. So we're kind of seeing these both direct and indirect links from poverty and development agenda into production. But there could be other reasons why kind of poverty and development agenda are going to be important for world politics, particularly when they're measured, when these measures are used for targeting the poor, which the kind of PPP and MPI were actually specifically designed to do. So they were set up and designed specifically to classify, identify who is poor, who is non-poor. And so kind of when these poverty measures are used for targeting, they often end up in policy by sort of segregated systems of social assistance and protection. So the poor get social assistance and the non-poor get some sort of social protection or social security. And there is an argument again by Fisher here that this kind of segregation and focus on identifying and targeting the poor can really have ideational consequences in terms of rendering the poor as passive recipients, which has kind of been typical in right-wing political attacks against universalism and welfare more generally, definitely over the past few years. And so again, kind of creating scope for sort of right-wing narratives, and also thinking about that in terms of the rise of populism, and again kind of tapping into some of the ideas that Ian talked about. What are the implications of that for world politics? And another sort of influence or implication for world politics that I think is kind of particularly interesting, that is to do with the measures themselves, is that the kind of the fact that these money metric and kind of increasingly multidimensional measures of poverty have been adopted as targeting mechanisms in lots of different countries. They've already started to influence the countries' agendas of data collection. So it means that there's like lots of statistical kind of technical pressure on those agencies. This pressure is now huge. And we've talked about kind of the limited capacity of these states in their technical units. But the MPI in particular was, designed by a group of Oxford econometricians, and the ins and outs of the kind of the way it's constructed are pretty opaque to the uninitiated. So does the fact that these measures are incomprehensible to most folks actually mean that they could actually reinforce sort of deference to the experts producing the data, or at least, in providing training to others to produce them? So interesting to think of the poverty in development data agenda as potentially being kind of a continued reproduction of an institutional dependency on so-called developed country academic institutions and international agencies, kind of in this constant updating of poverty and the way it is represented. So is it creating this kind of new kind of dependency? It's an interesting question to explore, the technical dependencies, and not sort of material dependency, but one of kind of technical expertise. The other big story of this period has also been the dramatic rise of China, which presents a completely different ideological narrative. And so far, really, the story of China has been weaved into the dominant narrative on poverty with let's say, a large degree of creative license by emphasizing its liberalization from closed Maoist economy. But this kind of narrative generally really avoids, I would say, the legacy and ongoing strong degrees of state control and state-led developmentalism that really explain a large part of the poverty reduction experience in China, and especially on the human development side. And China is another example where kind of poverty statistics are marshalled in support of statist developmentalism. So interesting what might happen in the future given China's increasing role in world politics. And so I want to leave you with a few takeaways. So I appreciate it's been a very full-on, content-heavy 50 minutes, but really these are the key points that I want you to take away. So really the science of poverty measurement, it took off in the 1980s, but came into sharp focus in the 1990s and early 2000s through these different agendas. So the World Development Reports, the Human Development Reports, the MDGs and the SDGs. And of course, there are different ways of conceptualizing and measuring poverty, and these can be unidimensional, like the money metric measures, and multidimensional, like the HDI and Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI. But both of these approaches, so whether we measure them in a unidimensional way, whether we measure them in a multidimensional way, there's kind of no escape that they appear not to be too scientific after all. And poverty measures of all kinds, shape and size, are really shaped by politics and ideology. And why does this matter for world politics? Well, when these measures are used not just as an evaluative device, so we're not just using them for academic purposes, but we're actually using them as a tool for policy implementation, this is problematic. And this will really be the case wherever the power lies. The direction of travel, however, will obviously depend on shifts in the geopolitics. And I'm going to leave you with another little thought task. So given what you know now, would you draw the chart any differently than when you drew it at the beginning of the lecture? And whatever your response, ask yourself why. Until next time.